Hello, everyone. I'm Mirsad Kriještorac, and I'm joining you from South Florida. I'm senior researcher at Bratislava-based Minority Issues Research Institute, known by its MIRI acronym. Our MIRI is dedicated on working towards promoting and protecting human and minority rights in Slovakia and abroad. We believe in the importance of research, education, and active involvement in shaping a more just society. As a part of our activities, we hold monthly conversations with experts and people around the world about the important international affairs and affairs significantly affecting societies and minorities as our effort to educate and empower general public. Today, we are talking about the racism manifesting itself as Islamophobia in Europe and in the West, and about the recently published book, Everyday Islamophobia. Islamophobia is increasing in the European Union and the Western world in general, both in terms of policies and attitudes toward people who are Muslims or perceived to be Muslims by others. Islamophobia is defined by most researchers as a form of racism and exclusionary transgressions, and it should be addressed as such by the states and societies globally. Although the consequences of Islamophobia are serious, often even deadly, they are not addressed adequately by the European states, institutions, nor their societies in general. Many policymakers and non-Muslim people think that Islamophobia is a problem of only the Muslim community and look the other way, as they do not see how it relates to them as non-group members. Others ignore the problem because they do not understand how detrimental Islamophobia is for their societies in general and for the Muslim citizens throughout Europe. Some wrongly believe that Islamophobia is only about negative attitudes toward minorities by the individual extremists without real policy implications. To address those mistaken attitudes, increase awareness, and educate the public about the serious problem, MIRI is organizing this timely conversation with Dr. Peter Hopkins, professor of social geography at the Newcastle University, about his recent book, Everyday Islamophobia, published this year by the Bristol University Press. The book will be moderated by Dr. Samira Azabar, who also published several important articles detailing the lives of Muslims in the European Union. I read Dr. Hopkins' book last week, and I was very impressed how thorough and well-organized the book is, covering all aspects of this serious problem that Muslims and societies in Europe and elsewhere are facing. So I recommend it to everyone. Good news is that the book could be easily reached as an open source via internet, so people can read it everywhere. And I will post the link for the book in the chat. To repeat the usual conduct for our event, we are going to first hear the presentations by our guests for about half an hour, and after that, we will open a discussion for the questions and answers. At that point, if you want to ask a question in person, please raise the hand icon and we will call upon you. Once your microphone is on, please introduce yourself and tell us where are you joining us from, and then ask your question. You're also welcome to type in your question in the chat box and we will try to ask them on your behalf. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Samira Azabar as our moderator. Both her and Dr. Hopkins are distinguished scholars who published important works on Muslims in Western Europe, and we are glad to have them with us today. Dr. Samira Azabar is a postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University, Netherlands. She investigates Muslim inclusion and exclusion in racialized societies and has written on radicalization, political agency, gender, intersectionality, and Islamophobia, emphasizing agentic and intersectional approaches. She's joining us from Antwerp in Belgium. Dr. Samira, please take over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mirsad, also for the invitation and for organizing this session. It's truly really important, as you stated, of course, recognizing also the state of Islamophobia in European states. Now, also, thank you for being here, Peter Hopkins. As previously stated, Peter Hopkins is Professor of Social Geography at Newcastle University in the UK. He has written widely about issues of Islamophobia, racism, Muslim identities, and intersectionality, publishing therefore also several books on these and related topics, including his latest on everyday Islamophobia. He's joining us from Glasgow, Scotland. Welcome, Professor Hopkins. In a way, as Dr. Mirsad stated, it is indeed crucial to study, but also bring out awareness about Islamophobia, especially in current European context, where the far right is gaining power, promoting fear and division, but also spreading harmful narratives about Muslims. It has thus become more than ever important to challenge Islamophobia and strive for radical equality. And that's also what you're doing with your book, bringing about what Islamophobia is all about, and indeed bringing a really thorough way of writing about Islamophobia, compromising also different research that already has been done, but actually focusing on everyday forms of Islamophobia, which is also a new, relevant, and innovative way of studying Islamophobia. Now, to get a grasp of your book, Professor Hopkins, but also to gain some insights in your relevant book, you have now 25 to 30 minutes to summarize a bit your innovative research and writing, and then we'll have a conversation, as it also is so thoughtful, provoking that it brings about also some questions. So I will give you the floor, Peter.
Okay, thanks very much, Samira, and thank you to Mirsad for organising this event. So I'll just say a few bits about because I feel like I've been working on this book for about 25 years, because I've been working on issues to do with racism, Islamophobia, basically since I was doing my master's degree at Strathclyde University in Glasgow, before I moved to Edinburgh for my PhD. And so there's quite a lot. I feel like it's been a kind of career book, in a sense. But there's a few things that drove me to write it. One of the main things I wanted to get across is I find it quite problematic when people talk about everyday Islamophobia. It feels to me like they're sort of putting it against all the other types of Islamophobia, and quite often it's seen then that it's like not as important as the other forms of Islamophobia. So you've got this everyday Islamophobia, and people kind of know what that means. It's, the comments at the bus stop, or, the unfortunate glances when you're on the train, awkward encounters in the supermarket and all those types of things, and people are going to know what that means. But it seemed to be quite separate from like sort of political Islamophobia enacted, say, by the state, or by international organisations. Those are kind of talked about quite separately, and I don't really see them like that. So I wanted to try and provide a way of sort of integrating the different sets of debates around that. I think partly that's an academic thing to do with different disciplines. So you get the specialists in, say, counter-terrorism that look at, terrorism legislation and policies to do with terror, and, it's quite state-focused, it's quite policy-heavy, and they tend to focus on that level. You then get this sort of more sociological, grounded work that's quite often feminist. Some of the really good work's feminist. It's ground up, it's about lived experience, it's about the body, it's about emotion, and those are kind of dealt with quite separately, whereas I don't think they should be. I think they need to be a bit more integrated. So in the book, one of the things I was happiest about the book is the table that I produced of all the different types of Islamophobia. Because there's different terminology used for it. Some people talk about, institutional and structural Islamophobia. There's interpersonal Islamophobia. There's Islamophobia that's intersectional. There's Islamophobia that's embodied. And, some of the literatures deal with these separately or only deal with one or two of them. Whereas I think that all of them combined are a part of what happens when we experience everyday Islamophobia kind of on the ground. And so in a sense, I wanted to offer that more, to me, that more kind of comprehensive view of everyday Islamophobia, because I think it might help people to understand what's going on when they do have the racist encounter on the street in public space. It's not, quite often I hear people say, oh, well, it's just an uneducated other who's made an unfortunate remark, or they've been persuaded by the far right, or whatever it is. And yeah, that's all true, but there's a whole layer of other things going on at the same time. So that was one of the main things I wanted to try and get across in the book. And through the different examples I've given, I've tried to show how the state level Islamophobia, say Trump's Muslim ban, these kind of state-sponsored they can be national, but they can also be transnational. In the case of Trump's Muslim ban, I mean, that was right across the globe, labeling 7 countries as Muslim majority countries they didn't want people to travel to or from. So there's that. There's the Chinese and how they've treated the Uyghur migrants. And there's a lot. Everyone will know a politician that they could point out that is explicitly Islamophobic, and that's a sort of national scale Islamophobia, but that trickles down and affects everyday interactions and encounters, and so I didn't want to see them as being separate. And likewise, there's like media networks and politicians, public intellectuals, and all the rest of it. They're all a part of this as well. So that's probably my main thing that I was wanting to get across. The second thing was I've kind of produced this rough idea of what I've called the Islamophobia industrial complex. So I borrowed from the idea of the military industrial complex, and there's a really great piece of work by Junaid Rana on the terror industrial complex. So an industrial complex is basically a set of organisations and individuals that produce a set of industries and financial beneficiaries. So I think the terror industrial complex is a really good example. So we see that, and that there's people employed in counter-terrorism, there's state officials. In the UK, there's the prevent strategy, and most big organisations have a prevent officer who's trained in all these issues and has to report to the government on various things. So you've got that whole industry there. People get trained on it. There's people that are paid to offer training on it. There's a whole set of financial beneficiaries and people paying their rent and being able to live off of all of this. And so I wanted to extend that argument to basically say that there's an Islamophobia industrial complex. So there's this set of individuals and organisations and networks and NGOs who financially benefit from promoting Islamophobia. And I think this is one of the reasons that we see at the moment, certainly, but previously as well, such a sort of surge in Islamophobia, as Mirsad said in the introduction. So in this industrial complex, I see the state as the main actor. So we see this through, I've already talked about Trump, but we see in particular through counter-terrorism measures and the way in which states across the world have introduced those, and they've copied models from certain countries that don't necessarily work very well. I mean, I read something about the kind of counter-terrorism approach used in the UK. I think it was copied from the Netherlands and it went to the US, and the Chinese have used it as well. And it's just mind-blowing because there's loads of critiques of it and how problematic it is, and there are alternatives, but this has kind of been copied. So the state is the main actor, but around this industrial complex are also far-right activists who make a lot of money from promoting Islamophobia. They're paid to do so. There's the media, in particular the right-wing media, but the media in general, and people writing on social media, bloggers, journalists, and so on. There's think tanks, and a lot of these think tanks are really positioned very close to government or have government representatives on them. There's public intellectuals and figures, and this is probably the most difficult group to nail down, because in that group are some academics who think they're being clever by being public intellectuals, but in profiling certain issues, what they're doing is providing a platform for the sharing of Islamophobia. So I'm sure most academics can think of a colleague who might do this inadvertently. They think they're being clever by having a public debate about immigration or something like that, and actually what they're doing is profiling quite far-right views. There's then politics and politicians, like I've discussed, and there's plenty of politicians that stand up and make explicitly Islamophobic comments, knowing that it will generate attention and interest, and particularly off the back of that, you just one comment can generate a whole load of Islamophobia. We saw that in the UK when Boris Johnson wrote an article in the Telegraph in which he compared Muslim women looking like letterboxes when they wear a veil or a headscarf. And like within the next week, there was, I think it was a 375% increase in incidents of Islamophobia. So there's a whole network of issues there. And then we've got sort of right-wing religious groups as well. So we've got this network or complex, as I've called it, this industrial complex of people, organisations, think tanks, activists, the media, who all benefit from promoting Islamophobia. And I mean, the media, again, you could point out certain people, but I always remember last year in the summer when there was riots in the UK in kind of late July, early August, and one of the pictures that was going around at the time was pictures of the front page of the Daily Mail with really, anti-migrant, kind of anti-Islam kind of headlines. And I remember the lead editor being interviewed, and he looked so smug. He was really happy with himself. And I was sitting thinking, it's because he's making loads of money from this. He's really chuffed with himself. His bank balance is going to be looking really nice. So this is the kind of thing that I mean about this industrial complex, is people who benefit financially. They promote this and they continue to do it because they basically make money from it. So and so throughout the book, I tried to give examples of how the complex works in terms of across kind of transnational issues, politics and politicians, networks, including the media, and then how this kind of trickles down into sort of institutions and into everyday life. So I'd say that's my main contribution, if you like. And also just generally, I've also tried to set out some of the other issues that I think are important around what's happening. And one of the things I think that's really key is I think we're seeing a mainstreaming of really quite right-wing narratives and issues. And I mean, there's a really great book by Aurelian Mondon and Aaron Winter on reactionary democracy, and they've written a similar piece about Islamophobia in ethnic and racial studies. And basically, the mainstream. I mean, it's amazing now. It's really easy, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure it is in other places. It's really easy to find news articles or coverage about immigration. It's like everyone seems to be talking about it, and it's because it's been mainstreamed, and the mainstream political parties are talking about it as well. So it's not just this marginal issue that's confined to the very far right. And there's a bit of a mythology going on that I think a lot of the mainstream political parties think that people want to have a public debate. They say that there's a populist demand for debate about immigration, and I just don't think there is. Right? There's a populist demand for debates about lots of other issues like healthcare, waiting lists to get a doctor's appointment or to get a hospital appointment, everything else that we know is important. How to get childcare costs, public transport costs, minimum wage, levels of taxation, all of those types of things. Instead of talking about those, they're talking about immigration. And so this kind of platforms the people that are part of the industrial complex. They're making even more money from it. Whereas I think that needs to be closed down completely so they can move on and actually address the real issues. And as part of that, these very far right ideas get platformed, as does some of the conspiracy theories about Islamophobia and about immigration. And we see more of that get mentioned and get, I can see it very easily online, on the news, on any social media app. There's loads of stuff like that at the moment, and it's just not an issue in the way that it's presented. So there's a big issue around that. So I've tried to cover some of those issues as well as covering the sort of empirical examples, if you like, of how Islamophobia operates on the ground. And then probably the hardest chapter to write was the last one, because there's two things I always get asked when I do a topic about this. Because I'm not a Muslim, people will say, well, why do you research Islamophobia? Why did you get into this? and I've got my answer for that in the introduction. And then the other thing is, oh well, you know, when people hear about how concerning it is and they're very worried, they say, oh, well, what should we do? Okay, what can we do? Like, what's the answer to this? And the thing is, there's lots of answers, and there's lots of really great work out there where people have, like, you know, there's great work in at the European level, you know, trying to work with like local government level and how, you know, to create anti-racist cities and stuff like this. There's great work, you know, educational initiatives and that. But I tried to make the argument here that those will only have a certain amount of impact unless we deal with the more structural and institutional factors first. So I make the point that basically we need to abolish the industrial complex. We need to make it that these people can't benefit financially from promoting Islamophobia, and that there's no money in it, and that they'll go and do something else. You know, we need to strip all that back, strip back all the counter-terrorism measures. You know, because if we don't, the kind of educational activities and the other actions that people suggest won't have as much impact. And there was a really interesting book I read that talked about the counter-terrorism approaches are so embedded that it's not just about removing them, it's also about removing the thinking that's a part of them, because there's a whole generation of people that have been trained, you know, since 9/11 have been trained in this methodology and this way of thinking. There's no point in doing away with it and just keeping those people there. Those people would need to be retrained and to think completely differently about it, because they'll just continue to enact what they've been trained for like 20, 25 years to do. So, you know, so I tried to set that up as part of the challenge. And of course, that makes it really difficult. So whilst I think it's great that there's lots of initiatives, there was some great work out there, stuff about grief activism in Canada in response to like tragic issues, events that happened, and people use like social media activism and grief activism as a way to get the message across. I mean, there was some great approaches, but it was really hard to write that chapter because there's so many different approaches and sort of angles on it. So that's a kind of a whirlwind tour, if you like, of some of the key reasons I've written the book and the key points that I wanted to get across. So I'll pass back to Samira, and hopefully I've given a reasonable summary there.
Yeah, it was more than reasonable. Thank you very much, Peter, for providing us indeed the key aspects of your book. I think there's much more we can say about the book and the contributions you make, and thought it was really interesting to couple up with the theory, but also the case studies of how does Islamophobia get a face in real everyday life of Muslims in Europe and abroad, in the US, etc. So I think the case studies are really exemplary of how Islamophobia works. And as you stated also in your book, how it works in different ways over different contexts. So it gets different faces, which needs also, and what I thought it was really nice to read in your book, is that it's not only an analysis of what Islamophobia is and what the faces of Islamophobia are, but most importantly also that there is actually a responsibility towards everyone to tackle Islamophobia and to tackle injustice and to search for radical equality. So that was something that really spoke to me in that way. But there is also a lot of discussion, of course, and questions that we could raise towards the book and what you bring about. So I thought it was really interesting to hear about what you've previously stated in your introduction in the book, but also right now, is that the term Islamophobia is well discussed in academia, but also in media and in certain citizen groups, contrasting it with anti-Muslim racism, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Muslimism. So we have a lot of terms to negotiate about, as in what would be interesting. Now, while such discussions could be indeed well-intended, they sometimes distract also from action a bit. What you propose in your book to go over to action after the analysis you have provided. What would you say then to those who spend their energy taking issues with that kind of conceptualizations of how we talk about Islamophobia?
That's a really good question. I think people need to get over themselves. I'm just really tired of the whole debate. You know, I'm very happy to have a debate, an academic debate about terminology, right? I think it's good to have terminology and, you know what we're defining. But in nowhere else have I seen such a set of debates over terminology. You know, and you know, in the UK, the government have consulted various times around this, and at the moment they've apparently proposed yet another definition because all the ones they've got aren't enough. And I just think, what are you playing at? So they've got all these other definitions. There's the Runnymede Trust definition from '97. There's the revised definition 20 years after that. The All-Party Parliamentary Group in British Muslims produced a definition that was widely consulted amongst academics and politicians, and it was a cross-party proposal over like certain parts of that. And then more recently, Dominic Grieve chaired a group of people in the UK to come up with another definition that I've not yet seen. I was consulted about it, but I've not yet seen. Apparently, it's with the government for consultation, right? And I think I think it's almost like moving the peas around the plate.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of phrase. You know, I feel like that's what they're doing. I don't really mind what they call it. If they call it Islamophobia, fine. If they don't like that and they want to call it anti-Muslim racism, that's fine. To me, they're the same thing. You know, if they want to call it, you know, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Muslim hostility, you know, there's strengths and weaknesses to each term. But I think it's almost to me, it's a strategy of avoidance. It's like to go away. And you know, like I say, we don't see this with any other term. You know, like people, the one I hear the most is, oh, Islamophobia. Phobia, you can't be phobic of a religion. You know, and you're like, come on, it's, you know, it's the same, it's implied the same as homophobia, right? It's the same sort of principles around it. But, you know, I don't see a whole debate about how we define homophobia. People kind of know what it means and they've accepted it as a term, and they either use it or they don't, and they use something slightly different. There's not a whole debate around it. You know, so I know in a lot of the European, I think, I'm not quite sure of the source of it, but I know in a lot of the kind of European level work, there's been debates, and some countries don't like Islamophobia, in particular France, because they don't believe in it. And then there's been a whole thing about, oh, well, I think through the European coalition group, it's been anti-Muslim racism. Well, that's fine. So if they've defined it, they know what it is. Let's sort it out and address it. So I think it's almost, if we keep debating the term, it means that there's no action. And it's almost, it means that we can just sit back and not address the issue. So that's kind of that's where I stand on that. And you know, and again, there's a whole series of definitions that people could pick if they don't like, you know, if they don't like the Runnymede Trust one because it's too wordy, or they don't like the APPG one, or they don't like the European one. You know, they can make up their own one. I don't mind. But for me, it's more like, let's move on and actually look at the effects that it has and the damage that it does, so that then we can look at solutions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. I think it's also really interesting, and tapping also into what you stated, if we look towards, and that's something that you mention also in your book, the relevance of the lack of data on Islamophobia, that we do not have that much data on Islamophobic attacks, suppression, marginalization, on the different phases of Islamophobia across Europe. Why is it so crucial to highlight that kind of lack of accurate data?
Well, I think if the people that don't like the term Islamophobia or don't want to have a debate about it, will something they'll quite often say is, oh, well, look, there's not really that many incidents. If you look here, there's only been this, so it's only so many percent, and they'll almost use the lack of data as an evidence for it not existing. Whereas I think because there's this debate, and apparent debate, I don't actually think there is a proper debate, but there's apparent debate around it. I think when it comes to actually recording it, it depends what kind of country you're in and what the setup is. So there'll be lots of Islamophobic incidents that get recorded as racism. You know, some of them might be recorded as sexism because it's against a woman and it's like gendered Islamophobia, but they don't actually have a category of Islamophobia. Or if they do, the people that are doing the recording aren't fully aware and are a bit nervous around it because there's this sort of anxiety around the term. So we don't then have the data. You know, so I think if there was, it wouldn't necessarily solve all the problems, but I think if there was a clear way of recording it and we can actually see how many incidents there were, then it would be, you know, the evidence base would be clearer. I know some people would advocate for sort of intersectional reporting. So if it was gendered Islamophobia, it would be sexism and Islamophobia and racism, and you would kind of tick all three boxes for the one incident sort of thing. You know, so there's that issue as well. I do think it's really tricky, but I think that'll be, you know, it's about how the kind of process works on the ground.
Yeah, and how could you maybe also explain the lack of data as an issue, notably also that it could be a result of Islamophobia itself, that governments and states actually decline to do indeed proper research on that?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think because there's this whole debate around the terminology, and it's almost like we don't really believe that it's a thing because we have to debate this term and was it made up almost. I think that's. I mean, one of the arguments I make in the book as well is in terms of the types of Islamophobia. There's hate crime, stigmatization, and discrimination, and those three are used in some of the European work. Added onto that, there's also silences and absences. So Islamophobia can be sort of enacted through just not being mentioned and not included. So it's sort of brushed under the carpet, it's not included, it's not referred to. And we can see that in, say, hate crime reporting mechanisms where there's not an option to record something as Islamophobic. It's only as whatever the other categories are. Or that if something happens that is Islamophobic, it just kind of, it doesn't get mentioned. It kind of, you turn a blind eye and you look the other way rather than actually addressing it head on. And that is in itself, I think, is Islamophobic. And I think there are states and government departments that will do that. It might partly be an ignorance thing and they don't know how to record it, but it can also be a specific strategy of sort of avoidance and like pushing it aside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Mirsad. Go ahead.
This is a quite interesting aspect of the problem. And as I was reading it too, I was quite interested in that concept of internalizing Islamophobia. So it's oftentimes Muslims themselves are also kind of part of the problem, if I may call it like that. I had a chance to speak to, let's say, local hate crime task force and some local law enforcement people, and they also say they simply don't report. Muslims experience Islamophobia on every day almost, but they don't report. They don't know who to call because sometimes they don't have that, how you say, capital to essentially understand, okay, I called this, I call somebody else, and that becomes a problem also on its own. That internalized acceptance of this type of attitude. So I found that quite interesting, and I would love, Dr. Hopkins, if you can kind of elaborate on that internalized Islamophobia, because I think that's a part of the problem in terms of lack of reporting.
Yeah, no, definitely that's a really important question, I think, and I suppose I think it points to the fact that Islamophobia isn't necessarily just a non-Muslims onto Muslims issue. It can be within the community as well, and there's different examples of different types of Islamophobia, depending on the type of Muslim that you are, and it might be the mosque you go to or the particular affiliation that you have, and there can be Islamophobia between and within the community sort of thing. So there's an issue around there, around that. And I do think that unfortunately there are people that are discriminated against, and this doesn't just apply to Muslims. This applies to lots of different people that are marginalised, who almost start to take on and accept the marginalisation they experience, and it's just seen as a normal part of their everyday life. So they won't necessarily see it as an issue to complain about or something to raise an issue about, because they've almost like internalised it. And they agree with some of the stereotypes, or they actively reinforce those. I think that's a minority of the case, a minority issue, but it does happen. And likewise, like Mirsad's just said, I think there's a whole set of issues around reporting. Lack of trust in the police. We've just done some work in the northeast of England because there's a new anti-racism coalition set up. We've just done a survey. And one of the questions is around reporting. So this wasn't just to Muslims, it was to a whole range of different types of people. But there was big issues about lack of trust in the police being institutionally racist and Islamophobic themselves. So why would you report? People were worried about the sort of, revenge for somebody being reported, and that they then become even more victimized. So there was a whole, they didn't trust the police, they didn't think anything would happen, they didn't think it would be a priority, they didn't think they had the evidence. So we know that there's lots of reasons like that why people don't report, but there are other ways that it can be done, say through third-party reporting services. you know, and where the data could be collected, but it needs to be easily accessible, available, and also the people that are recording it need to know to record it as Islamophobia, and that is one of the categories that's available to them. You know, there are specialist sort of charities and NGOs that will record Islamophobia, and a lot of them have got apps and things, but then you need to know about them. And if you don't know about them, then you wouldn't know to report, sort of thing. So the whole challenge around those issues in terms of how you provide a framework that makes reporting easily accessible and available.
Yeah, maybe also to tap in what you've both stated, and in particular, Peter, as you stressed that Muslims are also tired of reporting, right? If I talk to Muslims in my research about reporting Islamophobia, that they state that they have to report every day, in particular if we talk about everyday Islamophobia, that they have to report such things, and that it's tiring. And if you have to report it to the police, who's also well known for ethnic profiling and other racist aspects, that is also really difficult. And it's also a bit what you stated, right, about the Islamophobia industrial complex. It's everywhere, it's powerful, and it produces and promotes Islamophobia actually every day on as its core task, and it gains from it, right? So in particular, if it involves also state institutions, but also police, etc., would you say then that if we look towards the state's participation in Islamophobia, is that kind of a resulting in mainly from social attitudes and populist pressures, or is it the state policies themselves that feed into those attitudes? So is the state following what there is as feelings among citizens, or is it the other way, notably that the state is feeding them these attitudes and a normalization of anti-Muslim sentiments? So it's a bit the question of the chicken or the egg, what was first?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there's probably a bit of both going on, and they might be mutually reinforcing. You know, so the state will produce certain legislation or policies or enact a new strategy in something, and then you'll have this sort of cycle of change, and it's almost like that then shapes the media, and you know, things happen on the ground, and you know, the things that happen in like schools or colleges or universities or health institutions or whatever, and you end up with this sort of cycle of like mutually reinforcing of Islamophobia. I'm sure there's cases where it might be that one has more power than the other and has more of a, you know, the chicken or the egg type of thing. One of them is more powerful, sort of thing. But I think in most of the examples I can think of, I think there is a bit of a cycle where they kind of refer back and forward to each other. If that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And it is a complex situation, of course, of state institutions involving in actively promoting Islamophobia, harmful discourses. Because they are systematic, it's harder to challenge them, right? What would you say as in interesting things to challenge that on a systematic level? So the system as such.
So one of the things I write about in the book is I think I call them like mechanisms of circumvention and ways of avoiding addressing Islamophobia. So one of the issues you see is in policy terms, it's often called deracialization. So this will be a policy on, it could be on anything, and it just doesn't mention race at all, which and therefore doesn't mention Islamophobia. So you might have a policy on almost anything. It could be a health policy, it could be a policy on housing or something like that, and race just doesn't get mentioned. And it's a way of sort of I suppose it's a form of silencing and absences, because so Islamophobia and racism just don't get mentioned, therefore aren't included and aren't considered. And in a sense, they're being Islamophobic, and they could have a really Islamophobic housing policy or transport policy or whatever it is, but because it's deracialized and it doesn't mention race and it doesn't mention Islamophobia. So things like that, you know, a strategy could be for organisations or individuals to challenge whatever level of government it is, to say, well, look, you've not mentioned Islamophobia here. I mean, in Scotland, there's a race equality action plan and there's like an equalities plan as well, and they don't mention Islamophobia. They've even got a separate section on like Roma and Gypsy traveller communities, and they mention race, so it's not deracialized, but it doesn't mention Islamophobia. And I've said this to several people, this doesn't mention Islamophobia. You can do a word search, it doesn't even mention it once. And it's almost like it's kind of not even considered. So perhaps one strategy can be to say, well, look, you need to consider Islamophobia. So in a sense, they're being Islamophobic through omission and by kind of brushing it under the carpet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also towards, if we talk about discussing what goes wrong within state institutions and programs and policies, to call them out and then also focus on them. You also mentioned within that kind of industrial complex, focusing on Islamophobia, that media could also be targeted, or they should do better in dispersing also harmful narratives. And you mentioned also some kind of some types of research stating that the term Muslim and Islam has mostly been conflated with a terrorist or threat, etc. So there's also that kind of analysis already have been done if we look towards media, and it's something that happens throughout Europe, right? So would you say that there are also positive changes or actions that have been done? I think you referred to the PART framework in your book about portrayal, accuracy, representation, and terminology, which has been developed for media professionals in Scotland. Could you elaborate a bit on this initiative, as in what are the key points that taken up?
Yeah. So one of the many things I've done on my work in Islamophobia was I helped to set up a cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament on tackling Islamophobia, and that ran for about 3 or 4 years. And one of the issues that was identified in that was an issue about media and journalists and media coverage, including social media, but also mainstream newspapers and things like that. And so we worked with a Scottish Muslim journalist and produced a set of media guidelines for journalists, and we were very clear. That we wanted journalists to almost have this on their desk. So we came up with a short part: portrayal, accuracy, representation, and terminology. Because they're under pressure, they're busy, they've got to get so many articles out, they've got deadlines, and they need to quickly write something, and they hear this really exciting story coming in, and they need to quickly write about what's happened. So this was the intention. The extent to which it's happened is another matter, but the intention was that journalists would have this available on their desk, and it included the picture. We were very important that we included the picture editor and the people that are in charge of images as a part of that. So it's not just the person that's writing the text, but really we wanted them to quickly think through those 4 questions. Portrayal: what is it I'm portraying here? Am I using the right terminology? Is it accurate in terms of what it's saying? Just to run through those questions. And again, terminology was one of the big ones. Am I using any terminology that could be seen to be sensationalized or problematic? And you see that in a lot of the really Islamophobic stuff, particularly in the US. It'll say Sharia law. It's like everyone thinks Sharia law is going to be imposed everywhere. That type of thing. It's like, is that the right term to use? Or would it be better to use a different term? And and there's some really interesting studies where they've done sort of counts of words used in the media in terms of like terrorism and Islam, the equation of putting together of them, and there just tends to be far more sensationalized language used in the media around those issues. But the media make a lot of money from doing that, so there's an issue there in terms of how you deal with that. So we published that, and we got the National Union of Journalists sort of shared that with their membership. So we hope that it's getting used, but it's only one part of an answer to quite a complex issue, given all the actors that are involved in the industrial complex.
And could you say that this actions or reports or suggestions could also be used in other West European countries or European countries as such? Although we know, as you stated also in the book, that Islamophobia has different faces, and that it's also depending of national context how Islamophobia is getting his way out. Would you say that in a way this could also be used in other countries for journalists?
Yeah, definitely. I think it could be. I think there's lots of points there that, and I mean, again, we're not thinking here of some like radical rethink of journalism. It's just it's almost a quick check, and it might just be a word change in the title that would make something sound a bit less sensationalist. It might just be the image that, not to have a veiled Muslim woman in the picture. Just some small things like that just might make a slight change to how an article comes across and how it's received. So I think it'd be great if more places were to use it, and I think it could be applied in lots of different contexts. People producing like mass media that's going to be read really widely.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Missart.
Yes. Before I go, I see Robert raised the hand. Robert, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I don't know how to operate the hand signal on Zoom, sorry. And thanks very much, Peter. I haven't read your book yet, but I will get a hold of it. And so my name is Robert McNeil. I'm speaking, like Peter, from Glasgow, and I'm a former forensic technician that worked for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in Bosnia, gathering evidence of genocide against Muslims in particular from the Srebrenica area, and I did that work for 6 years. But the point I wanted to make to Peter was that I've been increasingly aware about the Islamophobia in the media, in particular. A UK broadcast station run by a right-wing politician, and I watched that program just to see. I watched that program open-mouthed, actually, about the level of Islamophobia that's been allowed to be broadcast, and they tend to use immigration as the umbrella, if you like, but it's clear that it's racism, and in particular against Muslims. And I just wondered if you're aware that this is a specifically British thing, or is it international? Do countries in Europe, and I'm sure Mirsad will know those in America, where they're allowed to broadcast this blatant racism and Islamophobia? And the really worrying thing that I've discovered is the increasing audience that they have. An academic from Glasgow University, Professor Alison Phipps from UNESCO RILA, wrote an article recently saying that, in her opinion, that the UK is already a few steps up on the ladder of prejudice that can lead to genocide, which is obviously very worrying. But my question really is, are you aware of this type of media broadcast internationally?
And just if I can piggyback before you, because it's the same thing, right? Since Robert mentioned, I'm aware of American media that does that thing. I'm not. I threw the television out of my house, literally from the 5th floor, out, right, during the Bosnian War, because I realized exactly like you say. So let's take it to the next level, right, to the third images. We say in academia, during the Bosnian, I realized how much of the reporting is basically done through this lens of Islamophobia, which then people, like in the case of Bosnia that Robert mentioned, they used to justify it. We now struggling, for example, it's like you mentioned, interestingly, that there's a big debate about the definition of the word. We struggle to assert that what was committed in Bosnia against Muslims was genocide. And this is not our terminology. It's basically ruled by the International Court. And we're trying to basically constantly repeat or constantly remind people that it is a genocide. I mean, we have, dozens of court cases, international court cases, in which Robert have participated, that ruled it was genocide, right? But still somehow, the BBC reports it's a massacre. It's not a genocide. Others report, and that's a form of denial. And so what I'm trying to say here is that, and that's why I'm saying it comes on top of what Robert mentioned, it's not only about reporting local events. It's also about reporting international events where this Islamophobia problem becomes even larger because local person may know a neighbor who is a Muslim and he will find some levels of empathy, like, oh, I know the guy, he works and stuff. But the local person has a very hard time finding this, ground for empathy with somebody far away, like somebody in Bosnia, right? So, or somebody in Morocco or someone someplace else, right? And then Islamophobia becomes literally deadly. And so I guess we should also maybe elaborate a little bit on that level. And since this part is essentially addressing how journalists portrayed, I just wanted to add a comment.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Mirsad. Also a really important question and contribution, and I think that we can tap into that also with the current case, but let me give you the floor, Peter, to answer Robert's question first.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of different media channels in different places that are increasingly promoting these types of narratives. In the US, certainly the UK, the US, Australia, there's some really bad stuff in Australia that I've read about. But I think because of the sort of the increasingly, in one sense, it's celebrated as a good thing, the sort of democratization of the media, and people can set up podcasts or news channels or, set up a blog and like write lots of stuff, and that can be shared internationally. I mean, this is probably one of the biggest challenges in addressing Islamophobia, I would say. So if I really wanted to, start, watching some, Islamophobic news channel every day, I could just set it up on my phone or my computer and tune into that news channel every day. And then, and I think this is what happens to some people. And, and I mean, the case of, I think both Anders Breivik in Oslo and Brenton Tarrant in the Christchurch incident, they were both reading stuff that was produced by Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller in the US, who produced all these Islamophobic media posts and were paid six-figure salaries to do so. And it was shared internationally. And I think in one of the manifestos, or both of them, like Robert Spencer was quoted like 32 times or something like that. And this is just blog posts, and as any issue happens, they make some Islamophobic post about it and they get shared. So I think there's a real challenge of the sort of the transnational, the international nature of it. And it can just be one incident, relatively low key, unlike those, because those were big incidents, become a low key incident. Suddenly it's got like international news coverage and it's on all these channels, particularly the right wing channels, and people talk about an incident happening somewhere, and it's a suspected as Islamic terrorist or whatever, and suddenly that kind of feeds the fever of it. So I think that's, to me, that's the scariest part of how this works, because if maybe I've got too much faith in formal politics, but I do think if we got sensible people elected and that actually dealt with the issues, there could be a sort of minimisation of Islamophobia in the political sphere. But the media is just, it's like free range, and and a story can be shared so quickly in social media. And I mean, I was at an event the other night in the Scottish Parliament for the launch of Islamophobia Awareness Month, and one of the speakers was a former police officer who'd served for like 30 years, and he's now a bit more free to speak because he's no longer a serving officer, and he's now I think he's a hate crime policy worker now. And he said the one thing that people shouldn't do is platform these issues on social media. So if you see a post that's Islamophobic, don't comment on it and don't repost it with a comment, even if you find it really objectionable, because he said that just feeds all the algorithms and everything, and it just gives it more status than what it should. He was almost like, don't do that. So I think there's a whole set of issues there, not just with like mainstream news reporting, as Robert said, but also just across social media and all the different ways that these things can be shared. And even like public intellectuals having big followings and things like Substack and stuff like that. So like in the UK, Matthew Goodwin's got a really big following in Substack, and I mean, he's so right wing, producing all this like anti-immigration rhetoric. I mean, like he's it's really dangerous, but he's got a big following and can just post on there, and he's got people ready to read it. To me, that I don't know what the answer is to that. It's quite scary, actually. But I do think that's one of the big challenges of the industrial complex.
Yeah, and what reminded me when reading your book, Peter, was also the whole Gaza genocide or the Palestine genocide that is going on, and it's also reflected on by Mirsad, as in all the evidence is present, and even then you have governments, media, politicians, political parties, think tanks, etc., also can actually portraying a whole other image of what is going on. Even human rights organizations striving to get the idea of the genocide into where media actually also constantly focusing on it, that it's a war. And the second thing that was also really interesting that taps into your book is that the conflation of Muslims and terrorism, where almost all citizens in Gaza have been seen as Hamas terrorists, which also made this genocide possible. So even if we talk about discrimination and racism and Islamophobia, we always think that it is to a sense of certain level that we can discuss it, but then people normally or rationally think that if we go into that kind of genocide level, that people would be awake, that state governments won't go so far to protect a colonist state, or that media would actually search for more, as in the type of watchdog function that a media should have. And we do not see that at all. So even with the Bosnian genocide, we always thought it would happen again, and thus it happens again. And it's mediatized, it's televised, and all people react to that. So how can we then, if we talk about international and transnational dispersion of that kind of Islamophobia, how could genuine citizens who care for that kind of situation to react upon that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of what you've said is around the ways in which these issues get sort of silenced, and there's like absences around them, which is a form of Islamophobia. It's almost like people don't want to mention it. I mean, it's interesting with the issue with Palestine. There's not that much research on it yet because it's just been happening quite recently with the recent issues. Obviously, it's got a longer history, but in terms of it being framed around Islamophobia, the Australian Islamophobia Register did a really interesting analysis of some media coverage. So Susan Carland was part of the team in that, and she's at Monash University and does some really great work. And they thought there was a real bias in media coverage against Palestinians, in terms of what they saw in the case studies that they looked at. But I think we need to say what it is and call it for what it is, and use the term Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. I mean, we see that in the UK at the moment as well. There's a whole issue around asylum hotels. And so hotels have been used to house asylum seekers. And this was introduced under the previous government. The current government are kind of getting a bad rap for it, but they inherited it. And people are angry that, illegal migrants, as they're getting called, but they're not, they're asylum seekers that are, have arrived in the UK have been put up in hotels. And there's all this stuff about, it's like luxury accommodation and whatever, and it's not. It's normally the least desirable hotels that, but there's a lot of protests going on around them by really far right groups, and and some of them are attacking the hotels and things like that. And one of the things that's just not been mentioned is how it's Islamophobic. There's almost no mention of it at all. And some of it isn't Islamophobia, but a lot of it is, but it's just not been mentioned. It's all like, anti-migrant sentiment and anti-this and, protests and all the rest of it. So I did write a little piece for the Bristol University Press blog on saying that this is Islamophobia, and we should name it as such. And I think that there's a lot of that going on with a lot of these issues. And I'm not saying that that's the same as the Gaza thing, to be clear. They're two quite different issues. But I think it's like people almost don't want to name it as such. And I think there should be more calling out of these things and more naming of it as such. Because that is what I think is going on. But there's this whole kind of subversion and silencing and absence going on. It's like we'll call it everything else that we can other than what it is, in my view.
If I may again interject, as I mentioned in the introduction, right, there is also the undertone so far that we have in our conversation of talking about Islamophobia, and we are, I think, inadvertently, but talking about immigrants and anti-immigrant attitudes. But we have to understand, like, second largest group of Muslims in Germany are Germans. So when we talk about Islamophobia, the problem of it perhaps is that colorblind racism. You know, we're talking about 1.3 billion people in the world who comes in all shapes and you know, ethnicities and colors and costumes and stuff. And it could be another Peter Hopkins who is Muslim also, right? You know, who lives down the street, or anybody else. This is often forgotten in this story. So that's, I think, also it's important to emphasize that the effects of Islamophobia are felt by the citizens in the society. So they're not necessarily immigrants. Plus, you know, what does it mean, immigrant? If you're Algerian, are you really immigrant in France? You know, after you have been part of the France for so long. If you're, I don't know, Indian or Pakistani, nowadays, right, defined as such, are you really immigrant in Great Britain? You know, after you have been basically, you know, part of the Great Britain Empire for so long, are you really immigrant? And so I think that it's also important to mention that this othering in terms of, well, what do you want? They come from somewhere, they're taking over this and that. They didn't come from anywhere. It's the people who actually live here. They have as much rights as anyone else to live here. And that's often forgotten. Like I said, we have, as you probably know, many British citizens or people who are in any way, shape, or form you want to define them as natives, who are also Muslims, right? And they also experiencing, how you say, Islamophobia. Many friends I have here in the United States who are basically as American, more American than I am, let's put it that way. And they will be told, go back to your country. And they say, where's my country? You know, my country is right here. So I think it's also important to, how you say, bring that dimension to the discussion, right? That Islamophobia, that it is being basically practiced, advertised, you know, utilized by policies and policymakers, are having negative effects over the citizens of that society, not only immigrants.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I mean, I think everything you said keeps making me think of my PhD research, which was in Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland, and I did focus groups and interviews with young Muslim men. They're nearly all Scottish Pakistani Muslims, but basically they sound just like I sound because they're Scottish. You know, when they weren't immigrants, they were born in Glasgow and, you know, the same place that other people were born. And you know, they have a Scottish accent. They were born in Scotland, and they would make the same claims to Scottishness or being Scottish that I would make. You know, that was one of the things I covered when I interviewed them. They would say, "Well, yes, I'm Scottish. I was born in Scotland. I've got a Scottish accent. My family's Scottish." You know, they would say all the same types of things, but they happen to have this Pakistani heritage sort of thing. So they made the same claims, but also just in what Mirsad said, it's made me think that there's a whole range of other groups that are also affected by Islamophobia that aren't necessarily Muslims, and in my view, therefore damages the whole of society. So there's a whole range of other ethnic and religious minority groups who are mistaken for being Muslim and experience Islamophobia as a result of it. So we've seen that in research in Scotland. We interviewed 17 Sikhs, Scottish Sikhs, and they all said that people thought they were Muslim and they experienced Islamophobia as a result of that. And I think nearly all of them were born in Scotland, so they weren't immigrants. They were Scottish born, Sikh heritage people. It's the same for Hindus. It's the same for people with quite diverse heritages. You know, as the refugee communities, there's a lot of African communities that with Christian heritages, because they're black, people think they're Muslims and experience Islamophobia as a result. So it's got this quite worrying web of effect across a whole range of diverse communities that, you know, aren't Muslim at all and might not know very much about Islam, but they experience Islamophobia as a result because it's a form of racism. and the people that are anti-immigrant or anti anyone that's not white or whatever they see the local community as being. So it has this sort of effect across a range of different communities. And as Mirsad said, it's not just recently arrived and migrants. It can be people that were born and brought up in the country and are a part of the fabric of it and have the local accent, and whose parents have always lived in the local community and or in the city or whatever, but they experience it because they've got this, they're seen as belonging to a particular community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I'm just looking at the time and the audience. I would actually give the floor to the audience whether someone has any question for Peter or his book, and otherwise I do have some. Just looking towards those who are present. So the audience may ask questions now. I think we have a lot of listeners. That means also that it was quite clear. If anyone has any question, you can raise your hand. I do have some final questions also, Peter. If we look towards your final chapters, describing also personal and collective harm that has been caused by everyday Islamophobia, and given also this urgency, in particular in Europe, where we look towards the rise of radical right and radical right parties being part of governments with harmful policies that they have been suggesting. What kind of concrete steps of focus would you recommend for both Muslims and Muslims to confront Islamophobia in daily life? Now, we also stated that if we want to abolish that kind of Islamophobia industrial complex, that there needs to be done a lot in a way. Where would you prioritize?
That's a tough question. I think at the moment, I think one of the most worrying things is the mainstreaming of far right issues. I think people need to massively push back on it. I would start pressing politicians to actually address the key issues, and stop talking about immigration, which is a backdoor to allowing Islamophobia to be talked about. I would be so in the UK, I think we see far too much of Nigel Farage. I know he's got a small group of politicians elected, but we hardly ever see the Liberal Democrat leader. I certainly hardly ever see him in the news or been mentioned yet. They've got far more seats. So there's a total imbalance there in terms of news coverage. And the mainstream parties need to talk about the actual issues that are important to people: public transport, healthcare, childcare, schools, education, universities, all the type of things that people are worried about or are a part of their daily life, and not talk about immigration, because most people aren't bothered about it. They're bothered about their pension or their elderly parents in a care home and how much it's going to cost, or when they're going to have their knee operation because they're on a waiting list, and or how their child's going to get into the local high school because there's some issue about how the places are managed. Those are the types of things that people are bothered about. I think far more, and other research has shown that's what people are bothered about. The politicians aren't talking about that. They're talking about immigration like there's some sort of demand for it. So I think, to me, some of that could change things quite a lot if immigration wasn't on the news all the time and wasn't being talked about by the mainstream politicians, and instead they were talking about actual real hardcore issues, whatever those might be, because they'll be different in different places. I think it would feel a lot less of an issue. I can't remember. There was a really interesting study once, and I need to find it because I've not been able to find it for some time. But it put the population into sections, and it was almost like if there was 4 sections of the population. You've got the sort of left wing, anti-racist, anti-Islamophobic type, and then you've got the really right wing, and you've got the 2 groups in the middle, who are quite flexible and could be persuaded either way. And it's almost like you need to try and bring those people to one side. And at the moment, what I think's happening is those kind of middle ground people are being drawn to the right because they're hearing all this stuff about immigration and concerns about, asylum hotels or, new arrivals or boats or whatever it is they're hearing. And this is the same in lots of different places. It's the same in Australia as well, where there's a lot of narratives around these issues. You know, in Australia's not really getting an issue. Australia's far away for people to get to. You know, it's not got lots of countries nearby. So it's almost like how can we draw those people more towards the left rather than towards the right? And what I think is happening at the moment is they've been drawn towards the right because these right-wing narratives have been mainstreamed and people actually are concerned that they're real issues and that therefore they want to vote for, say, Reform UK or whatever the kind of right-wing option is, rather than being more centrist in what's going on. And I think that could really change things, because if it then changes who gets elected and you end up with more mainstream parties that are actually talking about the real issues rather than the really right-wing groups, you know, it could really change things. You know, it would take a while, but you know, that's probably the thing that I would think to do first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Nora, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's been really insightful so far. I'm based in the US, so perhaps things are slightly different in terms of policy and procedure, how things work here. But my question is, do you see any, you mentioned like, okay, we have to change the narrative. There's mainstream media talking, you know, in these very Islamophobic ideas and whatnot. Do you see the value in people kind of, how would I say, over here we have these reportings for hate crimes, right? Which I'm Muslim myself, so I see that we don't have a lot of Muslims that actually, they don't report these hate crimes that they go through, right? Because they are afraid of retaliation, or they think nobody's going to listen to them, right? But I don't know exactly how it works in Europe, but do you see any value in, for example, increasing this reporting of hate crimes? Because I'm online all the time, so I see some videos of you know, like the police coming for reported hate crimes, and especially England and stuff like that. And then I see the comments in which there's obviously people fighting back and saying like, oh, this is censorship, this is this and that, right? So when I hear you talking about trying to get people more, like, I don't know, what I hear is like trying to convince them to be more left-leaning. I see then these more right-leaning people that are saying, well, this is censorship, this is this and that. So it's like trying to kind of persuade people to go more left kind of can backfire and whatnot. So I just wanted to know what your insight is on this reporting, for example, of hate crimes. Do you think that that's actually beneficial, that actually brings to attention the, you know, politicians that can actually look at the statistics and say, well, you know, I mean, hate crimes against Muslims have tripled or quadrupled or whatnot?
Yeah, thanks, Nora. That's a really great question. I think obviously it's a tricky issue because you're always going to get people on the extreme right that will, like, you know, downplay everything and try and, like, you know, make it sound different. But I do think that if there was more reporting and it was, you know, there was, you know, put it this way, all these Islamophobic incidents were actually reported and recorded in some way. And so if it was, you know, whatever state in the US or, you know, a county in England or in Scotland or wherever, you could say, oh, look, there's been, you know, 3,500 Islamophobic incidents in, you know, London or whatever, and you can actually say what the number is. I think it gives hardcore evidence. It can be rejected by people on the right, but I just think it kind of adds extra weight to any claims that might be made. So it's not going to, like, solve the whole problem, but it's just now and then I do hear people say, oh, well, there's much more of an issue about the one thing I hear now and then is, oh, there's much more of an issue about white working class boys being excluded in schools and in college and whatever. It's not really an issue about Islamophobia. You know, and people will try and, you know, it's almost like, what about today? They'll try, what about this group? Or this is more of an issue. And I think it's because there's underreporting. So I think in one sense that could help in one way. And also your very interesting question made me think about the point I made in the book about the kind of strategies that people try to use to avoid talking about and kind of dressing Islamophobia. So I mentioned deracialization, but there's also things like clash of civilizations and moral panics that I think get used. You know, and so you'll get some alarmist politicians that, oh, there's going to be a clash of, you know, the Muslim, you know, Muslim community versus Christian America or whatever, you know, and it's just deliberately alarming and, you know, sensationalist. There's not actually a real thing. That's not actually a real thing. And likewise, you get moral panics around certain issues. you know, it could be around like grooming gangs or something like that, and there's all this alarming coverage around it, and it's all quite, you know, used to sensationalize things. And I think that's the kind of thing that I see a lot in the kind of comment sections when you look at the article, there'll be an article, and then there'll be like these really alarmist comments. Maybe we could call those out a bit more, because sometimes I do, and sometimes I can't be bothered with having the energy, sort of thing. But I think there's lots of different mechanisms that are used by those in the right to like avoid actually confessing that this is Islamophobic and it's unfair. So I don't know if I've answered your question there. So I don't think the reporting is going to solve everything. I just think it would provide more of an evidence base, sort of thing.
Right. No, I appreciate it. Thank you. And because you know, you've made some interesting comments, like when Dr. Mirsad was talking about how, you know, we often, when we talk about Islamophobia, we bring in immigration, even though there are people who are, you know, it's not even they have heritage from somewhere else. They just, you know, perhaps they converted to Islam or something. So they are, you know, everywhere this. I've personally experienced it myself, where people who are not Muslim have experienced Islamophobia. And what's really funny is these are people that are members of minority groups that do face racism and oppression, and they themselves throw back the Islamophobia, right? So they're like, oh, you're a Muslim, and they're like, I'm not a terrorist, I'm a Christian. And I'm like, all right, buddy, you're kind of defeating the whole purpose here. So it's really interesting, because that Islamophobia doesn't just come from the top down, it also comes from the bottom up. So it's like you're squeezed in every direction. So, I mean, you know, in America, I'm sure you see in the news that, you know, Hispanics are really a targeted population now. And there's some Hispanics that look, perhaps they may be Indian or something. And to the average ignorant person, they're just like, oh, you're Muslim. And the Hispanic person's like, well, I might be an illegal, but I'm not a terrorist. And I'm like, all right, buddy. Okay. So it's interesting to see it even on that level.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nora. I think that is indeed also what has been stipulated in Peter's book, as in how some groups also could be perceived as Muslim and experience Islamophobia. The reaction is also about internalizing Islamophobia in a way that is widespread in society. But also interesting, and I think to tap into your question, Nora, is that what I've seen here in Europe, but also in the US, that a lot of people are focusing more on hate speech and Islamophobia and how it influences the weakening of our democracies, right? So it's not a kind of a specific advantage that Muslims are asking, but stipulating mostly the idea of how our democracies are weakening, but also how human rights are not really respected when discussing or talking about Muslims in the West as a minority group in its all. So that is the harmful aspects that we need to counter in a way. I don't know whether there is room for a last question from the audience.
I think we have to wrap up. So it's we can continue conversation on and on, but we have to wrap up at this point. And so, any concluding thoughts, Dr. Samira and Dr. Hopkins?
I will give you the floor, Peter.
No, just to thank everyone for coming. And in addition to the book, I've got there's a couple of animations on my YouTube account around, you know, what is Islamophobia, and also around everyday Islamophobia. So obviously you could buy the book if you want, and there's a picture of it there. But there's also some other resources that I have if you look there that might be of use to people. So I'd just like to thank Samira and Mirsad for organising and chairing, and thanks to everyone for coming as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, a bit similar. Thank you all for being present, also for engaging with this seminar. Also, Dr. Mirsad, thank you for organizing this. And Peter, many thanks for writing the book and giving us this seminar in your your intro of the book, your insights, but also mostly not only the analysis of Islamophobia as I stated, but also a kind of a call to everybody who reads the book, as in everybody can do something. It's everybody's responsibility to work towards equality in our society, and I hope that it will be read by a lot of people. And for the audience, it's open access, so everybody can read it, and I would recommend the book. So thank you for that.
Okay.
And I will give you the floor, Dr. Mirsad.
Yes, thank you again, both of you, for joining us today and having this important conversation. I hope everybody will continue to follow work of MIRI. We are trying to create a space for minorities through our institute based in Slovakia, and we're looking forward to see you next time. I will advise, or rather invite you one more time, to read the book, Everyday Islamophobia, but also read some important work that Dr. Samira have written. A few of the articles I got a chance to access, and they're quite important also on this similar subject, on the various aspects of manifestation of Islamophobia. And we very much appreciate you, Dr. Samira, for doing it and for also moderating today's conversation. So with that said, thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.